My parents secretly drained my accounts to fund my brother's lifestyle and locked me out of my own home. They thought I would stay quiet to keep the peace. Instead, I took them to court and legally stripped them of everything. I'm 29 years old, and for the last decade, I have sacrificed absolutely everything to build a stable, successful life. I grew up in a household where nothing was ever handed to me. My parents were not exactly poor, but they were incredibly irresponsible with money. They constantly lived beyond their means, leasing cars they could not afford and taking vacations on high-interest credit cards. But the most glaring issue in our family was not the debt. It was my younger brother, Kyle. Kyle is 25 and he is the absolute definition of a golden child. In my parents' eyes, Kyle has never done a single thing wrong in his entire life. When I got straight A's in high school, I got a pat on the back. When Kyle managed to pass physical education with a C-, they threw him a dinner party. I moved out the exact day I turned 18, worked 3 jobs to pay my way through a computer science degree, and eventually landed a highly lucrative job as a senior software developer for an international tech firm. Kyle, on the other hand, dropped out of community college after 2 weeks, refused to get a job because he claimed standard work hours disrupted his creative flow, and spent his days playing video games in our parents' basement. Despite all of this, I still loved my family. I wanted a relationship with them. So, when I started making real money, I tried to help them out. 3 years ago, I bought my absolute dream home. It was a beautiful 4-bedroom house with a massive backyard in a quiet, upscale neighborhood. I paid the down payment in cash. The house was entirely in my name. About a year after I bought the house, my firm offered me a massive opportunity. They wanted me to head up a new project management team in London for 18 months. The pay bump was enormous, and the company was paying for my corporate apartment overseas. But that left me with a problem. I had an empty, fully furnished 4-bedroom house sitting in the States. Right around that time, my parents called me in a panic. Their landlord had decided to sell the house they had been renting for the last 10 years, and they were given 60 days to move out. They had zero savings, massive credit card debt, and nowhere to go. My mother cried on the phone, begging me for help. She said they would end up living in their car. Against every single instinct in my body, I made the worst decision of my entire life. I told them they could live in my house while I was in London. I set some very strict ground rules. They were living there rent-free, but they had to cover all the utility bills, keep the house perfectly clean, and most importantly, Kyle was not allowed to move in. I knew exactly how Kyle lived. He was a slob, he broke things, and he had a terrible habit of throwing loud parties. My parents swore up and down that Kyle was going to stay with a friend and that they would treat my house like a museum. To make things easier while I was out of the country, I did something incredibly stupid. When I was 19, I had opened a joint checking account with my mother so she could help me deposit checks from my fast food job. I never took her name off the account. Since I needed a way to ensure the property taxes, the homeowners association fees, and any emergency repair costs for the house were covered, I transferred $80,000 into that old joint account. I explicitly told my mother that this money was an emergency fund for the house only. It was not a gift. It was not spending money. It was a safety net for my property. I hugged my parents goodbye, handed them a spare set of keys, and boarded my flight to London. For the first 6 months, everything seemed fine. We did video calls every few weeks. The house looked great in the background. My mom assured me the bills were being paid on time. I was so incredibly busy with my new promotion that I did not have the time or the energy to scrutinize the bank statements. I trusted them. They were my parents. The nightmare started during month 14 of my contract. I had just wrapped up the massive software deployment ahead of schedule. My boss was thrilled and told me I could take a month of paid leave and head back to the States early. I decided to surprise my family. I did not tell them I was flying home. I just packed my bags, grabbed a taxi from the airport, and pulled up to my beautiful house on a Tuesday afternoon. The first thing I noticed was the smell. As soon as I walked up the driveway, it smelled like stale beer and garbage. My front lawn, which used to be perfectly manicured, was overgrown and littered with fast food wrappers. There were 3 rusted, broken-down cars parked on my grass. I felt a knot form in my stomach. I walked up to the front door, pulled out my key, and slid it into the lock. It did not turn. I jiggled it. I pushed against the heavy wood. Nothing. They had changed the locks on my house. I pounded my fist against the door, my heart pounding in my chest. After about 3 minutes, the door swung open. It was not my parents. It was Kyle. He was wearing dirty sweatpants, holding a half-empty bottle of soda, and looking at me like I was a stranger who had just interrupted his favorite television show. The moment the door opened, the smell of cigarette smoke and wet dog hit me so hard I almost gagged. I looked past him into the hallway. The hardwood floors I had paid thousands of dollars to refinish were deeply scratched and covered in mud. There were holes punched in the drywall. My expensive custom-made sofa was sitting in the living room, completely torn to shreds, with a strange dog sleeping on top of it. "What the hell are you doing here?" Kyle asked, crossing his arms. "You're supposed to be in Europe. What am I doing here?" I yelled, my shock rapidly turning into absolute fury. "This is my house." Why are the locks changed? Why is my furniture destroyed? Where are mom and dad? Kyle rolled his eyes and took a sip of his soda. Relax, man. Mom and dad are at the grocery store. And it is not really your house anymore. They gave it to me. My girlfriend is pregnant and we needed the space. You make enough money, you can just go buy another one or rent an apartment downtown. I honestly thought I was having a stroke. I pushed past him, ignoring his protests, and walked into the kitchen. It was a disaster zone. There were towers of rotting, unwashed dishes piled in the sink. The granite countertops were stained. The entire house looked like a frat house after a massive week-long party. While I was standing there in pure disbelief, the front door opened again. My parents walked in carrying grocery bags. When my mother saw me standing in the kitchen, she dropped a bag of apples directly onto the floor. They rolled everywhere. She turned completely pale. "What are you doing home?" she stammered, looking terrified. I walked slowly toward her, shaking with rage. "I told you one rule," I said, my voice dangerously low. "I told you Kyle was not allowed to live here. You changed the locks on my house. You let him destroy my property." My father immediately stepped forward, trying to use his booming dad voice to intimidate me like I was still a teenager. "Do not speak to your mother that way under this roof," he shouted. "Your brother has a baby on the way. He is starting a family. He needed a place to stay, and you have a massive house sitting empty. You are being completely selfish. Family helps family." I did not care about his shouting. I pulled out my phone. "I am calling the police," I told them. "I'm having Kyle formally trespassed from my property right now, and you two have until the end of the week to pack your bags and get out." My mother started crying hysterically, but my father just laughed. A cold, arrogant laugh that made my blood run cold. "Go ahead and call them," my dad smirked. "You cannot kick us out. We signed a formal lease agreement. We are legal tenants. And the police cannot kick Kyle out either because he is an approved subtenant on our lease. It is a civil matter. It would take you 6 months to evict us through the courts. By then, the baby will be born and no judge in this county is going to throw a crying newborn out onto the street just because you threw a greedy temper tantrum." I stared at him. He was right. I knew enough about local tenant laws to know that the police would not touch an eviction without a court order. They had weaponized my generosity against me. They had planned this. "Fine," I said, trying to keep my breathing steady. "I will go to a hotel. I will hire a lawyer tomorrow. But understand this, I am cutting you off. The free ride is entirely over. I'm going to the bank right now and I am pulling the $80,000 out of the emergency house fund. You will not see another single dime from me for the rest of your miserable lives." My mother stopped crying immediately. She looked at my dad. My dad looked at the floor. The silence in the trashed kitchen was deafening. I opened the banking app on my phone. My heart, which was already beating out of my chest, seemed to stop completely. The account balance was not $80,000. The account balance was $14.32. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, completely unable to process what I was seeing. $14.32. I refreshed the banking application 3 times, praying it was a network error. It was not. The $80,000 I had painstakingly saved and set aside to protect my home was entirely gone. I slowly looked up from my phone. My mother was refusing to make eye contact with me, staring intensely at the kitchen tiles. My father had crossed his arms over his chest, puffing himself up to look as large and intimidating as possible. Kyle was just leaning against the counter, completely unbothered, taking another slow sip of his soda. "Where is my money?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Where is the $80,000? My father cleared his throat, trying to sound authoritative, but completely failing to hide the guilt in his voice. "Now listen to me," he started. "We had a massive family emergency. Kyle's girlfriend got pregnant unexpectedly. They needed to get a proper vehicle that was safe for a baby. They needed a crib, baby clothes, and Kyle needed to buy her a decent engagement ring to do the right thing. You were sitting over in Europe, living in a luxury corporate penthouse, making hundreds of thousands of dollars. You did not need that money sitting in a checking account doing absolutely nothing. You stole from me," I said, the reality finally crashing down on my shoulders. "You drained my emergency fund to buy Kyle an engagement ring and a car. It is not stealing." My mother suddenly shrieked, tears streaming down her face. "My name is on that checking account. I am a joint account holder. Legally, that money belongs to me just as much as it belongs to you. We did not want to bother you while you were working so hard overseas. We took what we needed to make sure your brother did not end up on the streets with a newborn baby. You should be happy we are taking care of family." She was right about one incredibly sickening detail. Because I was stupid enough to leave her name on that joint checking account from when I was 19 years old, the bank viewed her as an equal owner of the funds. She had every legal right to walk into a branch and transfer every single penny into her own personal accounts. The police would look at it, shrug, and tell me it was a civil matter. They had thought of absolutely everything. They had completely outmaneuvered me. I looked around the trashed kitchen. I looked at the scratches on my beautiful hardwood floors. I looked at my parents, who felt absolutely no remorse for ruining my life to prop up my lazy, entitled brother. "Keep the $14, I said, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. I turned around, walked out the front door, and got back into the taxi that was still waiting in the driveway. I told the driver to take me to the most expensive luxury hotel in the downtown financial district. I checked into a massive corner suite, ordered a pot of black coffee from room service, and opened my laptop. I did not cry. I did not scream. I felt a cold, terrifying sense of absolute clarity wash over me. My family had just declared war on me, and they mistakenly believed that because they had exploited a legal loophole with a joint checking account, I was completely powerless. They severely underestimated exactly how meticulous and resourceful a senior software developer can be when they are pushed to the absolute brink. The very first thing I did was pull a comprehensive deep dive credit report on myself from all three major credit bureaus. If my parents were bold enough to drain $80,000 from a joint account, I needed to make absolutely sure they had not compromised anything else. I downloaded the 70-page PDF report and started scrolling. By page 3, my blood ran completely cold. There were 4 new, high-limit credit cards opened in my name over the last 12 months. The mailing address for all 4 cards was listed as my home address, the house my parents were currently occupying. The total outstanding balance across the 4 cards was $96,000. They were entirely maxed out. I clicked on the detailed transaction history. The charges were sickening. There were thousands of dollars spent at high-end maternity boutiques. There were massive charges for luxury car modifications, expensive gaming computers, and a 2-week all-inclusive vacation to a luxury resort in Mexico. My parents had not just emptied a joint bank account. They had stolen my social security number, forged my signature, and committed massive, multi-count felony identity theft to fund Kyle's pathetic lifestyle. I immediately froze my credit with all 3 bureaus. Then, I spent the next 6 hours compiling every single fraudulent transaction into a massive, meticulously organized digital spreadsheet. I flagged the locations, the dates, and the specific items purchased. I knew for a fact I could prove I was in London working at a corporate office when a physical card with my name on it was used to buy a gaming computer at an electronics store in my hometown. At 8 o'clock the next morning, I walked into the lobby of the most ruthless, expensive real estate and financial litigation firm in the city. I did not have an appointment. I simply placed my corporate black card on the receptionist's desk and told her I needed to speak with a senior partner immediately. 10 minutes later, I was sitting across from a man named Mr. Vance. Mr. Vance was in his late 50s, wore a bespoke suit, and had the cold, calculating eyes of a great white shark. I slid my laptop across his massive glass desk and walked him through the entire nightmare. I showed him the drained bank account, the trashed house, the forged lease agreement my father had bragged about, and finally the $96,000 in fraudulent credit card debt. When I finished, Mr. Vance leaned back in his leather chair and steepled his fingers. He did not offer me pity. He offered me a battle plan. "The joint bank account is gone, mister," Vance said, his voice smooth and incredibly professional. Because her name was on it, recovering those funds through a civil suit would be exhausting, expensive, and likely pointless since they have already spent the money. However, the credit cards are a completely different story. That is textbook, undeniable wire fraud and identity theft. We are not going to sue them for that. We are going to the federal authorities. He leaned forward, tapping his expensive pen against the legal pad on his desk. But first, we handle the house. Your father claims he has a signed lease agreement giving him legal tenancy, correct? Yes, I replied. He told me it would take 6 months to formally evict them because of tenant protection laws. Mr. Vance smiled a very dark, very satisfying smile. Tenant protection laws only apply to legitimate tenants. If they produced a lease agreement while you were residing in London, they had to forge your signature on the landlord line. Furthermore, to make it look official to the local police, they likely had it illegally notarized. If we can prove the lease is a fraudulent document, they are not tenants. They are hostile squatters who have broken and entered into your property. I spent the rest of the week living in the hotel, working directly with Mr. Vance's team of private investigators and paralegals. We filed an official police report for the identity theft, handing over my corporate travel logs and passport stamps to definitively prove I was thousands of miles away when the credit cards were physically used to buy Kyle's gaming computer and his luxury vacation. The Financial Crimes Division of the local police department took one look at the $96,000 balance and immediately opened a grand jury investigation. Then Mr. Vance executed the first phase of the eviction. He did not send a polite 30-day notice to vacate. He sent a formal demand letter to my parents' lawyer, a cheap strip mall attorney they had hired using my stolen money, demanding a certified copy of the supposed lease agreement they were using to claim residency in my home. 2 days later, the fake lease arrived at Mr. Vance's office. It was exactly as we predicted. My signature at the bottom of the page was a sloppy, pathetic forgery. But the best part was the notary stamp. The document had been officially notarized by a woman named Brenda. I immediately recognized the name. Brenda was my mother's best friend from her weekly bingo club. She was a registered public notary, and she had illegally stamped a forged legal document as a favor to my mother. We had them completely dead to rights. They had built their entire fortress out of lies, forgery, and stolen money, and I was about to drop a massive legal wrecking ball directly onto the roof. On a rainy Tuesday morning, exactly 2 weeks after I had discovered my trashed house, Mr. Vance and I drove back to my property. We did not go alone. We were accompanied by 2 armed county sheriff deputies and a private locksmith. We pulled up to the driveway. The rusted cars were still parked on my dead lawn. The front door was closed, but I could hear the loud, thumping bass of a video game echoing from the living room. Mr. Vance stepped out of his luxury sedan, holding a thick folder of court orders signed by a superior court judge just 3 hours prior. The sheriff deputies walked up to the front door and knocked heavily. Police department opened the door, the larger deputy shouted. A moment later, Kyle opened the door. He was wearing the exact same dirty sweatpants. When he saw the armed police officers, Mr. Vance, and me standing on the porch, the arrogant smirk completely vanished from his face. What is going on? Kyle stammered, taking a step backward into the foyer. You cannot be here. We have a lease. Mr. Vance stepped forward, holding the court order right in front of Kyle's terrified face. The lease is a confirmed criminal forgery, Mr. Vance said smoothly, which means you are officially trespassing on private property. By order of the county judge, you and everyone inside this structure have exactly 15 minutes to gather whatever belongings you can physically carry and vacate the premises. If you're still inside this house in 16 minutes, you will be arrested and charged with criminal trespassing and breaking and entering. From the kitchen, I heard the sound of a ceramic plate shatter on the floor. My mother came running into the hallway, her face pale, with absolute terror. You cannot do this. She screamed at the deputies. I am his mother. We have a baby on the way. This is illegal. The larger deputy put his hand on his utility belt and looked her directly in the eye. Ma'am, you have 14 minutes left. I suggest you start packing a bag. The next 14 minutes were a blur of absolute pathetic chaos. My mother let out a terrified shriek and ran into the master bedroom, frantically shoving wrinkled clothes, expensive shoes she had bought with my money, and cheap cosmetics into black plastic trash bags. My father, finally realizing that his booming voice and intimidation tactics were completely useless against 2 armed law enforcement officers, paced back and forth in the ruined kitchen. He was furiously dialing numbers on his cell phone, screaming at the operator, trying to find a lawyer who would take his call on a Tuesday morning. But no lawyer in the world can stop a superior court eviction order signed by a judge. In the living room, Kyle was furiously unplugging the massive glowing gaming computer from the wall. He wrapped the expensive cords around his arm, grabbed the ultra-wide curved monitor, and tried to carry the heavy equipment toward the front door. I stepped right into his path, blocking the hallway. I looked at the taller sheriff deputy standing near the entryway and pointed directly at the computer in Kyle's hands. That machine was purchased 2 weeks ago using a credit card that was fraudulently opened in my stolen name. I told the officer, keeping my voice loud and clear. It is stolen property, and it is officially part of an active federal financial crimes investigation. You can check the serial numbers against the police report filed yesterday afternoon. The deputy placed his hand firmly on his utility belt and glared at my brother. Put the computer down, son, the deputy commanded. You are not leaving this property with anything that does not strictly belong to you. If you walk out that door with that tower, you're going straight into the back of my cruiser. Kyle's face turned bright red, transitioning from arrogance to pure panic. He dropped the heavy computer tower onto the scratched hardwood floor with a loud, sickening thud. He started screaming at me, calling me a terrible brother, a greedy monster, and a complete psychopath. He told me that his pregnant girlfriend was going to be homeless because of me, and that I was ruining an innocent baby's life. I did not even blink. I looked him dead in the eyes and told him he should have thought about his growing family before he decided to treat my life savings like his own personal lottery ticket. I told him he was a 25-year-old child who finally had to face the real world. Exactly 15 minutes later, the deputies forced my parents and my brother out the front door. They stood on the edge of my ruined, overgrown lawn in the pouring rain, surrounded by 4 miserable trash bags of clothing. The private locksmith Vance had hired immediately went to work. The sound of heavy metal drills echoed through the neighborhood as he destroyed the old deadbolts and installed heavy-duty, high-security locks on the front door, the back door, and the garage. My father stood in the wet driveway, completely soaked in the light drizzle, and pointed a shaking finger at me. You're dead to us, he shouted over the rain. I'm going to sue you for illegal eviction. I'm going to call the news stations. I'm going to take every single penny you have left for doing this to your own mother. Mr. Vance stepped off the porch and walked halfway down the driveway. He did not look intimidated in the slightest. He looked bored. He reached into his waterproof leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope. He handed it directly to my father. You're not going to be suing anyone, mister, Vance said, his voice echoing perfectly in the quiet neighborhood. That envelope contains a copy of the formal criminal indictment. The Financial Crimes Division has spent the last 48 hours reviewing the $96,000 in credit card fraud. They also spoke with your lovely friend, Brenda, the notary public. It turns out, when faced with 10 years in a federal penitentiary for being an accessory to felony fraud, Brenda was more than happy to strike a plea deal. She confessed to the police that your wife forged the lease agreement right in front of her on a Tuesday afternoon. My mother let out a loud, terrifying wail and collapsed onto the wet grass, burying her face in her hands. My father tore open the envelope, his eyes scanning the terrifying legal documents. Before he could even formulate a response, two unmarked black sedans pulled into the street and parked directly behind his rusted, broken-down vehicles, completely blocking them in. Four detectives in plain clothes stepped out of the cars. They did not ask politely. They did not want to hear excuses. They walked straight up to my parents, read them their Miranda rights, and forcefully pulled their arms behind their backs. The sharp, metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoed across the driveway. My parents were officially under arrest for multiple counts of felony identity theft, wire fraud, grand larceny, and forgery. Kyle watched his parents get shoved into the back of a police cruiser. He looked at me, his eyes wide with absolute unadulterated terror. He tried to slowly back away down the sidewalk, hoping the detectives would ignore him. But one of the taller detectives turned around and grabbed him by the shoulder. The police had traced the title of the luxury sports utility vehicle parked in the driveway. Because my parents had illegally purchased the vehicle using my stolen credit cards and registered it entirely in Kyle's name to hide the asset, he was officially in possession of stolen property valued at over $50,000. They handcuffed my golden child brother, read him his rights, and threw him in the back of the second unmarked car. He was crying so hard he could barely breathe. I stood on my porch with Mr. Vance and watched the police cars drive away, taking the absolute worst parts of my life with them. The silence that fell over my property was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. The nightmare of the eviction was officially over, but the financial investigation had only just begun. The next day, I walked through the house with a team of insurance adjusters and a forensic accountant. The damage was far worse than I had initially thought. It was not just scratched floors and broken drywall. My parents had systematically pawned nearly every valuable piece of furniture, artwork, and electronics I owned. My expensive leather sectionals were gone. My high-end home theater system was missing. They had completely stripped the house bare to fund whatever cash expenses the stolen credit cards could not cover. But the forensic accountant found something even more damning. While digging through the trash bags they had left behind in the garage, we found a crumpled receipt for a local climate-controlled storage facility. The unit was rented under my mother's maiden name. I immediately handed the receipt over to the lead detective on my case. The police executed a search warrant on the storage unit 2 days later. What they found inside sealed my family's fate permanently. The unit was packed to the ceiling with brand new, unopened luxury goods. There were expensive designer handbags, high-end watches, and massive televisions. My parents had not just been buying things for Kyle's new baby. They had been actively using my stolen credit to purchase easily sellable luxury items, stockpiling them in a hidden unit to sell on the black market for pure cash. It was a highly organized, systematic fencing operation. When the detectives presented this new evidence to the district attorney, the charges against my parents were immediately elevated to massive federal offenses. They were no longer just looking at a simple identity theft charge. They were looking at federal racketeering, systematic wire fraud, and organized theft. The bail was set at $500,000 each. Because their bank accounts were already frozen by the authorities and their credit was ruined, they could not pay the bond. My father, the man who had screamed that he would take every penny I had, was forced to sit in a cold county jail cell, waiting for his trial, wearing a bright orange jumpsuit. The extended family found out about the arrests a week later. My phone absolutely exploded with text messages and voicemails from aunts, uncles, and cousins I had not spoken to in years. At first, they were furious with me. They called me a traitor. They said I was destroying the family over a simple misunderstanding, and that I needed to drop the charges immediately. I did not argue with them. I simply had Mr. Vance email a public copy of the massive $96,000 fraudulent credit card bill, the forged lease agreement, and the police photographs of the stolen luxury goods hidden in the storage unit to every single relative who contacted me. The angry phone calls stopped immediately. Once my extended family saw the absolute undeniable proof of the massive criminal operation my parents were running, they completely cut ties with them. Nobody visited them in jail. Nobody offered to help pay for their defense attorneys. They were entirely, utterly alone. But the most devastating part of the revenge was yet to come. The criminal justice system was moving slowly, but the financial reckoning was about to hit them like a freight train, and it was going to leave them with absolutely nothing for the rest of their miserable lives. The criminal justice system operates at a glacial pace, but my civil lawsuit moved with the speed and precision of a guided missile. Mr. Vance was not just an eviction lawyer, he was a financial predator. While my parents and my brothers sat in their respective county jail cells awaiting their federal indictments, Mr. Vance filed a massive civil lawsuit against them. We sued them for the $80,000 they had drained from the joint checking account, the $40,000 in estimated damages they had done to my hardwood floors and drywall, and the massive legal fees I was incurring just to fix the disaster they had created. Because they were currently indicted on federal fraud charges, their chief defense attorney advised them not to fight the civil suit, fearing that any testimony they gave in civil court would be immediately weaponized against them in their criminal trial. They defaulted on the civil lawsuit. The judge ruled entirely in my favor, granting me a massive judgment of $150,000. But winning a judgment and actually collecting the money are two entirely different things. My parents had no liquid cash left. They had spent it all on Kyle's pathetic lifestyle and their hoarded luxury goods. But Mr. Vance knew exactly where to look. He subpoenaed their financial records and went directly after their retirement accounts. Normally, retirement funds are highly protected from standard civil lawsuits. However, because my parents had actively engaged in felony fraud and had illegally commingled stolen funds to sustain their lives, a federal judge granted our motion to pierce those protections. We legally seized every single penny of their retirement savings. We emptied their pensions, their mutual funds, and their small investment portfolios. The money was transferred directly into my corporate accounts to satisfy the judgment. In a single afternoon, the financial safety net my parents had spent 30 years building was completely erased. They were officially left with a net worth of absolute zero. 3 months later, the criminal trial finally began. It was the shortest trial in the history of the county. The district attorney had the forged lease, the security footage of them physically using the stolen credit cards, the receipts from the storage unit, and the sworn confession from Brenda the notary. My parents knew they were completely defeated. To avoid the absolute maximum sentence of 20 years, they accepted a harsh plea deal. I sat in the front row of the courtroom on the day of their sentencing. They were brought in wearing handcuffs and matching orange jumpsuits. They looked exhausted, terrified, and incredibly old. When the judge read their sentences, my mother let out a loud, pathetic sob that echoed through the entire courtroom. They were each sentenced to 5 years in a federal penitentiary, followed by 10 years of strict financial probation. Kyle received a slightly lighter sentence because he had not physically forged the signatures or opened the credit cards. But he was still convicted of receiving stolen property and being an accessory to federal fraud. He was sentenced to 3 years of high-security felony probation, 500 hours of mandatory community service, and he was legally ordered to pay 20% of all his future earnings into a victim restitution fund. The fallout for Kyle was absolutely spectacular. When his pregnant girlfriend found out that he was a convicted felon with absolutely no money, no car, and no future, she packed her bags and left him. She moved back across the country to live with her own parents. She filed for full physical and legal custody of the child, and because Kyle was a documented criminal with no stable housing, the family court judge granted her request immediately. Kyle is now legally required to pay child support on top of his federal restitution payments. With my family permanently removed from my life, I finally focused on repairing the damage they had done to my sanctuary. I hired a massive crew of professional contractors. They sanded and refinished the hardwood floors, patched and painted the drywall, and completely deep cleaned the entire property. It cost me roughly $35,000 to reverse the destruction, but the money did not matter anymore. Once the house was perfectly restored and looking like a beautiful model home again, I immediately put it on the market. Because the real estate market in my neighborhood had exploded while I was overseas, the house sold in 4 days for a massive cash offer. I walked away with a profit of over $200,000. I did not stay in the States. The entire ordeal had left a terrible taste in my mouth, and I realized there was absolutely nothing keeping me tied to my hometown anymore. I contacted my boss and told him I wanted to accept a permanent position at the London office. They were absolutely thrilled. They gave me another massive promotion, a generous relocation package, and a permanent corporate visa. It has now been 2.5 years since I walked up my driveway and found the locks changed. I'm currently sitting on the balcony of my beautiful, modern penthouse apartment overlooking the River Thames in London. I have a brilliant career, a wonderful circle of friends, and a life that is completely devoid of stress, manipulation, and guilt. Sometimes I get updates from a distant cousin about my former family. My parents are still serving their time in federal prison. When they are eventually released, they will be felons in their late 60s with absolutely no retirement savings, no house, and no credit score. They will be relying entirely on minimum wage jobs and whatever meager government assistance they can qualify for. As for Kyle, he is currently working 35 hours a week at a greasy fast food restaurant. He does not have a car, so he has to take the public bus 2 hours each way just to get to his shift. Every time he gets his tiny paycheck, the government automatically garnishes his wages to pay his child support and his federal restitution. He still lives in a cramped, dirty basement apartment, but this time, he actually has to pay the rent himself. My parents thought I would just roll over and accept their betrayal to keep the peace. They thought that because we shared the same blood, they were entitled to my success, my property, and my money. They learned the hardest lesson of their entire lives. Blood does not make you family. Loyalty, respect, and basic human decency make you family.